Can you build muscle and lose fat at the same time? A lot of people think the answer is quite simple. You can't. You need to do a proper bulk and a proper cut in order to build muscle and lose fat. Maintenance is not working. But is this actually the case? In this video, I'll tell you exactly how you can build muscle and lose fat at the same time. And I think this comes from the old school bodybuilding era where people would really go in an extended period of time bulking and then cutting it down to get in shape for their competition. But this study right here really challenges that idea. What they did is they basically literally overfed people with 600 calories on top of their normal surplus to see if that would lead to any additional muscle gain. And it didn't. But what it did instead is it made them gain 3 times the amount of body fat in the same period of time without additional benefit. So overfeeding and going on extensive bulks is not the answer. To give you the right answer, you don't need more than a 200 calorie surplus to gain muscle. And you don't need to, by that, gain more than 200 grams of muscle per week. In fact, for most people, you can't really build more than 200 grams of muscle per week because you simply don't have the anabolic capacity to do so. Advanced lifters is going to be even less, but if you're a beginner until intermediate stage, a 200 calorie surplus with 200 grams of muscle gain per week is probably going to be your sweet spot. And by looking at this, you already get to see that, hey, if I don't overdo it and kind of go for the long run, I'll get better results. And that's the case with fitness and almost everything in general. People who try to overdo it in the short term, in the long run, they always catch the short end of the stick. So be patient, guys, and follow your plan. Because otherwise, if you go too quickly, instead of spending 60 to 70% of the time in a calorie surplus making great progress, which would be as well approximately 30% of the time in a calorie deficit, what would happen is you would spend more than 50% of the time in a calorie deficit. Because if you know you can only put on 200 grams of muscle max per week, any additional weight over that, so let's say 300 or 400 grams, let's say it's 400 grams of body weight gained per week, that would mean that you lost a week of bulking and gained a week of cutting or half a week of cutting at the same time. So by this, what you want to do is you ideally want to spend the most amount of time in a year possible in a calorie surplus. And if you go too fast, that means less time in a calorie surplus and more time in a calorie deficit, which on a year to year basis is going to have a massive difference. And many of you know that I am a massive fan of this approach. Over the course of the last 12 years, I've basically cut down and bulked up every single time, which I think is the biggest reason why, for example, here in Bali, the fitness level is quite high. But not to be vain, I would rank myself to be amongst those with the at least relatively most muscled physiques. And that's because I've always had this approach. Whereas most people, they kind of stick around maintenance. They don't want to get a bit too fat in the off season or in the winter period. They want to keep looking good. But by doing this, they will look not as developed or book less progress than someone who actually does this. Other than knowledge and other optimization things, this additional unallocated amount of energy that is above your maintenance is really going to help facilitate more progress. But you don't want to overdo it either, because then you're just gaining fat, which you then need to take off again, which is what most people do. Most people think that bulking means eating a massive amount of food, and they end up in this overly exaggerated surplus, as you saw in that study right there, which just leads to fat gain. They gain all that fat, then they need to cut all that fat down, and eventually a year later they maybe gained 500 to 1, maybe 2 kg of muscle, whereas otherwise that could have been way more. And as well, in the majority of the time, not having a great physique either, because you're walking around the majority of the year with a pretty high body fat percentage. But it doesn't have to be this way. In fact, building muscle and losing fat at the same time is perfectly possible. And the reason for that is because the muscle system and fat system are basically two separate systems. Many people would get on board with this and say that building muscle and losing fat at the same time is possible, but not really practical, and probably most applicable for mostly just obese people. But in reality, it's actually very beneficial for much more people. And it's not only a few, it's actually most effective for almost everyone. First one being new lifters. People are in a beginning stage, and the reason for that is because they're early in, they are so primed for muscle growth. You basically only need to breathe over the barbell and you will already grow from that. Just like with everything, there's always a diminishing return curve in everything that you do. Any new skill you want to learn, whether it's snowboarding, skiing, whatever it may be, or just becoming better at math or starting a new business, in the beginning your growth curve is going to be pretty rapid. And then as you go and you become more and more advanced, the progress you have per unit of time is always going to diminish. And that's the same in a gym. And because you're so new and primed to this, your muscle building potential is still so great, you actually don't need to be in a calorie surplus at all. You can just be at maintenance or even in a deficit, and you could make the same amount of progress in a maintenance or deficit stage compared to a surplus, which for these people would be the best way to go. Because if you spread it out over a long term, let's say you have one guy as a beginner or a new lifter who's starting his fitness journey in a calorie surplus, he would build a certain amount of muscle, but as well accumulate fat gain, become more intermediate level. At that point, his body fat percentage is too high, he would almost need to cut down and get leaner. So let's say he's right here now, so he did that bulk, more muscle mass, new muscle mass, he's right here. Then you have another person who starts as well his journey but in a calorie deficit. He puts on the same amount of muscle mass, ends up here too, but he's totally lean. So what this guy can do, he can just extend going at it at the same approach, or maybe take on a slight surplus, and then he will be much further with even more muscle mass, whereas the other guy would kind of stall at this point because he's not as primed for muscle growth anymore. The actual additional calories would in this case help him. So now you already see, okay, which route do I take, which strategy do I take is really going to make a difference in the long run. Because then, another year later, it's almost like the guy who took on that surplus is 1 year behind the guy who didn't. For new lifters, this is very beneficial. The reason for that is next to their insanely primed state for muscle growth, they can take energy from their fat stores and use that to build muscle mass. That isn't really the case with advanced people. Second category is going to be overweight people, which kind of has the same mechanisms, because as well they're most likely going to be not super advanced and they have a large chunk of fat stores. They can take a lot of energy from this to use that to fuel muscle growth, which again would lead to approximately the same amount of muscle gain over time. So overweight people, perfect and best approach to go on a building muscle and losing fat at the same time recomp approach. Third group, detrained individuals. In this image right here, you see how muscle growth happens. So when you start, you create these cells within the muscle called myonuclei, and then after that growth happens. If you stop training, you're going to lose all of that and you get into a muscle with the same size as you had in the beginning, but you still have all these satellite cells in there. And these satellite cells basically never go away. They stick for around 50 plus years. So when you start training again, you skip this stage of accumulating those cells, which leads you to gaining back what you lost 6 to 7 times as fast. So let's say it took you 7 months to get to a certain result in the first place. You can get there again in 1 month without any calorie surplus required. So let's say you do that and then you're back at that point, or maybe even beyond. It would be much better to then continue in a calorie surplus instead and extend that journey once again, instead of saying, okay, now I'm overly fat, I'm kind of that overweight individual now in a way, and I need to cut down again. Then you get this gap in progress another phase later once again. And fourth is people who take anabolic steroids. What happens is, when they start taking steroids, they become so primed for anabolism as well that they almost enter a super physiological newbie beginning stage again, which make them super primed for muscle growth, that they can then, because of that hormonal support and that anabolism it provides, they can then make additional muscle mass without being in a calorie surplus. That's only possible when you have that support. And then I'd like to add a fifth category into that, and that is people who've been training very suboptimally for a large period of time. Training advancement is not measured by your training experience in years, because you have many people who go to the gym for on and off 3, 4, 5, 6 years, but actually when you look at their muscle development, they were still kind of in a beginning stage, which accounts for the majority of people who train in a commercial gym. Training for a long time doesn't mean you're advanced. After a certain period in time, simply being consistent doesn't do it anymore. You need to apply better knowledge. Let's say you want to become an ice skater, for example. What do you need to do? You're an ice skater, you're a beginner, your goal is to get gold medals or something at the Olympics. You'll probably most likely just need to ice skate more often, more frequently, more consistency in the beginning, and you would make a certain amount of progress with that approach, but then you would stall at a certain point. At this plateau you've reached now, doing more of the same isn't going to make you breathe through that plateau. What it is going to train smarter, focus on weak points, again and again and again, until maybe you need to implement and do certain things that have nothing to do with ice skating at all, recovery based. And constantly, if you use better knowledge, personalize your approach more towards your unique situation, every time you do that, you will then breathe through that plateau again and again and again. So the same accounts in the gym. These sub-optimized trainees, going based on consistency, eating healthy, training consistently, they plateau pretty quickly, which typically would be after 6 to 12 months. From this point onwards, you want to think, how do I train smarter? Guys, there is a massive difference between just doing a workout and actually training towards a specific goal with a solid concrete plan. A workout and goal-driven training are totally not the same things. I'm gonna give you the 5 steps to body recompositioning. So the first thing you need to understand, that in order to recomp effectively, you need to understand that training is going to be the driving force for progress. You don't have the caloric support to help you carry on that energy to then do the building for you. It has to come from the training side of things, which basically consists of 3 main principles. And one is obviously understanding that you need to apply progressive overload. Many people continue on bulking for way too long because they're afraid that when they start cutting, they lose their strength, which shouldn't happen. So whenever this is happening, this basically means that you're not training correctly. The only thing that should really change when you start to go from a surplus into maintenance or calorie deficit is the amount of training volume that you are running. And you always want to continue to get stronger at the same rate that you were doing whenever you were bulking. So you need to ensure that you're always still applying progressive overload. Second is understand that you need to have correct and actually perfect effort and technique. Very important. Another thing people get wrong all the time. Training and performing the exercise is not the goal. It is a tool to stimulate the muscle as effectively as possible. That is the goal. Training is only a tool to do so. Many people seriously overlook the importance of training, and they only have problem awareness when it comes to nutrition. They think the reason why they're not reaching their goals is because their nutrition isn't in line with what it should be. But actually, even if you would get your nutrition perfectly nailed down, most optimized as possible, you will still not get the results. Because even with all the nutrition in place, if you're not putting in the right stimulus in the first place, there's nothing for that nutrition to do. So you need to understand that training is going to be the driving force within this. So perfect effort and technique. Focus on time under tension, full range of motion, slow controlled negatives, and hit that stretch big time. Volume. Some volume guidelines for you. Train between 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week. Now, for some it's going to be more towards 10 sets, for some it's going to be more towards 20 sets. What I recommend you to do is to start with 10 and then increase 2 sets per muscle group per week and see how far you can build up until the point where you notice 2 sessions in a row you're not getting stronger anymore. So then you'll find out what is my max recoverable volume. You can calculate this as well, but it is very meticulous. You need a lot of knowledge to do so. So you could do this as well with this kind of biofeedback way of just starting with 10 sets and increase by 2 sets per week to find that sweet spot for you. So this is step 1 within the 5 steps to body recompositioning, understanding that training is the driving force. Second, you need to choose a primary goal. So you need to decide, am I going to focus on muscle building or am I focusing on losing body fat? And which one you should do depends on the body fat percentage you are at right now. So for males, if you are somewhere between 12 to 15% and for females between 18 to 28%, you want to focus on a calorie surplus and more on the growth side of things, because you're basically at a body fat percentage where you are going to be most primed for anabolism and growth. And what you want to do is you want to be at a 5 to 20% calorie surplus, all right? And aim for ideally 200 grams of muscle growth or weight gain per week, because as explained earlier, you can't likely put on more, so anything more is going to be excess fat gain, which leads you to cutting down longer in a yearly basis, which is less gains in a year time. Alright, then if you have reached 15%, you start to go down again, because above you're going to be somewhere off-road in a very suboptimal situation. Don't want to be there, not good for anyone, not good for yourself, your girlfriend. It's just you don't want to go there. Alright, so you go down from there. Then, if you are at 15% or higher, so let's say 15 to 25 most likely, you want to focus on cutting first to get down to that like 10-8% body fat range. Third, caloric intake and macronutrients. First thing to understand, in order for recompositioning to happen, you want to still stay somewhere near towards maintenance. You can have both the muscle mass and the fat loss occur at the same time. And for muscle gain, focus on a slight surplus of 5 to 25% above maintenance. And for fat loss, a slight deficit of 10 to 20% below maintenance. Protein intake, you just want to have it at 1.6 grams per kg body weight. This is enough. However, in most of the countries, food labels are going to be off 20 to 25% of the time. And sometimes with logging your nutrition, you're going to make some mistakes as well. So in order to kind of compensate for this and take this into account, just increase that 1.6 grams of protein to 1.8. You'll hear a lot of people preach 2 grams or 2.2, like 1 gram per pound of body weight. This is too high, guys. You're much better off allocating these additional proteins into fats and carbs, so you can basically use those functions to the best of their ability that will give you the best results. Reason why people preach these high amounts, I think, is from this old school bodybuilding era, because that's what all the big guys would do back in the day. Well, modern science has really shown that this is way too much and you're much better off with 1.6 to 1.8. As a natural, you simply do not have the anabolism to use that much proteins and turn it into muscle protein synthesis. So just keep it at 1.6 to 1.8. Now when it comes to fat intake, keep it around 1 gram per kg body weight. This is the optimal amount. However, if you notice practically that you're struggling to adhere to your diet when you're, for example, in a calorie deficit, you could bring it down to as low as 0.5. Just don't go below. So find a little sweet spot for yourself, and then all the remaining calories you're gonna use as carbohydrates. Fourth, optimize recovery and lifestyle. You need to understand that, again, training is the driving force for progress, and as well that sleep is basically the human superpower. Sleep is king. Everything you do is a form of stress, including all your training and nutrition, working, stressing, processed food, like literally everything is a form of stress. And within your recovery capacity, there has to be a balance there. And 70% of that recovery, which is all called systemic fatigue recovery, is going to come from sleep. There is no single nutrient, supplement, anything on the planet that can compete with the power of sleeping. And since you're in a calorie deficit, you kind of can't lean on too little sleep. Sleep is gonna have to carry you through this thing. So ensure that you always sleep enough, which is gonna be somewhere between 7 to 9 hours per day. So understand that poor sleep leads to poor muscle growth and poor recovery. There's this one other study that showed that people in a deficit who sleep 7 hours compared to 8 hours, instead of losing 85% fat in the 8-hour category, they lost 83% fat in the 7-hour category. Now you might think that's only 2%, but over time that is super significant. And all these optimization things, they're only small marginal incremental benefits, but they add up over time. And if you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, let's say 20 optimization points, that's going to make a massive difference. And as well, like look into sports like tennis, for example, a guy who would win straight sets 6-0, they basically have like 5 points per set difference, which is nothing, but it leads to someone being the big champion and the big loser. And manage your stress levels. High stress leads to poor recovery, less maximum recoverable volume, which leads to less results as well. Stress management and sleep are in general very important and overlooked. Then fifth, some additional optimization points is peri-nutrition and pre and post workout nutrition timing. This becomes very important when you're not bulking, because again, you have to lean on training being the driving force, and you still want to ensure that you're always getting stronger at the same rate as in a calorie surplus. And to ensure that you can do this, you want to make sure that within your pre-workout nutrition, you always hit at least 0.3 grams protein per kg body weight, along with 1 gram of carbs per kg of body weight 60 to 90 minutes before training, with a maximum of 15 grams of fat. Now, timing this nutrition is going to ensure that even though you're in a deficit, so you're basically eating literally less than your body needs to sustain itself, you still have the power and the ability to perform better and build muscle mass. So this nutrition timing becomes extremely important. Then I'm going to give you some additional supplementation tips that could help you on this journey, and I've kind of put them into a tier list. So these are only going to be S tier supplements, the only ones that will really help you. First one being protein powder, especially for vegans, which I assume we're not going to be. Vegans need an even higher protein intake, which is not 1.8 but actually 2.2. Getting your proteins from like peas and stuff, good luck with that. So you ideally would want to use some protein supplementation. But even if you're not a vegan and you struggle to hit those 1.8 grams of protein per kg body weight, using some additional whey protein, casein protein is going to be a great thing to choose. I like to just slam a protein shake after the workout on busy days, just because it's just not because there's any benefits to this post-workout protein timing, but just because it's easier for me to still hit those protein targets. Then second is going to be creatine monohydrate. Taking 3 to 5 grams of creatine monohydrate daily is going to have massive overall benefits. It's the most researched supplement on the market, and it could actually give you maybe 1 to 2 kg of more muscle growth per year. And on top of that, it's also very good for your mental capacity and capabilities, because what it actually does, it is literally increases your concentration span and concentration quality, and as well as a mood regulator and all these sort of things. So you're actually always very well off taking 3 to 5 grams of creatine daily for the rest of your life without any side effects. Then third is going to be caffeine. You need to be a bit careful with this one, because with caffeine you build up a tolerance, and regardless of how tolerable you are to it, the stress you get from it is always going to be there. Caffeine literally increases your rested heart rate, so it's a form of stress on its own, and you want to time it well. So no caffeine 9 hours before sleeping, as it reduces your sleep quality. And just make sure that whenever you do use it, you time it before your workout so you can have that upper edge and perform at the best of your abilities. So final thoughts. Recomp is actually applicable to almost everyone and the best option to go with, except for when you are a super advanced person in the gym. And you need to focus and understand that training is going to be the driving force for growth, and that you need to have quality within your training and apply progressive overload with all these principles that I explained earlier. And if you optimize your approach to training and nutrition, you'll actually always reach massive results from this, and much more than when you would take on a bulking or cutting approach. So this is what I would recommend you to do. Even if you're training for years on in the gym, this is the way to go. Apply these rules, principles, and information and watch yourself transform. If you need help with this, hit the link in my bio and we'll set up a one-on-one strategy meeting consultation to sort your physique out as well, so you can get lean, absolute machine, large and in charge for this summer. And please guys, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see y'all in the next video.